Last week, the second child in less than 2 months was hit by a motorist and killed while leaving their local school. The 11-year-old was about 50 meters from his home. We're barely into March, and the pedestrian death toll in Ontario's capital city is already in double digits. Mayor John Tory says, quote, "Whatever it is we're doing, it's still not enough." What will it take to make streets safer? Let's find out. We'll ask Scott Baptist. He's superintendent at the Toronto Police Service. Patrick Brown, the lawyer and principal partner at McLeish Orlando, and Jamie Stuckless, executive director of the Share the Road Cycling Coalition. And as I welcome all of you to our table here today, we should point out that not everybody watches us on television or on their computer. Some people listen to us as a podcast, so we clarify. The Patrick Brown who's sitting to my right is not the member of the Ontario Legislature. He's a lawyer, right?
That is correct.
That is correct. Good enough. Let's bring up, Sheldon, if you would, this first graphic and set the scene for our discussion to come. Here we go. The rising death toll in Ontario. There were 51 road fatalities in the first 8 weeks of 2018. 51. That compares to 31 deaths in the same time period last year. In Toronto alone, 13 people have died on the roads, 10 of those being pedestrians. And again, if we make the comparison to last year, 9 deaths, 4 being pedestrians. So again, the number's significantly higher this year. Let's get into this. Superintendent, I want to start with you. What do you make of those numbers?
They're shocking. I mean, every one of these incidents is a terrible tragedy. It is, there are trends that are being observed across North America. You look in the most recent research coming out of the United States, 27% increase since 2007 in pedestrian death. And there's a lot of research and there's a lot of discussion about what is causing this and how is this happening. And we're seeing a similar trend here in Ontario. So I can tell you that Toronto Police and the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police are working with our external partners and all stakeholders in this issue to try to find ways that we can better get out the message, better conduct enforcement, and address these issues, because we have to save lives. And Mayor Tory's comments about it being a crisis, it truly is. Right. We need to treat it that way.
We will unpack all of that as we go along. Jamie, you want to weigh in on that? The significance of those numbers to you?
Yes, thank you. I do think that those statistics are alarming, and they're not just statistics. Each one of those people was someone who was trying to get home at the end or beginning of their day to their loved ones and their family, and that did not happen. And that is the work that we are collectively trying to do in Ontario when we're out on our roads trying to get to where we need to be. It should not be a risky operation, and we have a lot of work to do to design safer spaces so that everyone arrives home safely.
Design is something we will return to in our conversation as well. Patrick, your initial thoughts?
Alarming, shocking, little's been done. We're setting records on the number of pedestrians being killed in our city. Last year we had a record, one of the largest pedestrian fatality rates in decades. So there's a dismal failure in preventing this, and it lies at various levels.
We do have to try to understand some of the reasons underlying all this. I'm sure they are multifaceted, so let's start to go through them. Scott, give us one reason why the numbers would be so much higher this year as compared to last.
This is a really difficult thing to try to unpack. When we look into our investigations that go into these things, there are so many factors that are contributing to it. And I can tell you, and I don't mean to sound in any way callous, but there's also the term KSI collisions, killed and seriously injured. When you look at KSI data, the difference between what can make a fatality versus someone who is seriously injured can sometimes just be, I mean, it's splitting hairs. Yeah. When you look at KSI data, the trend is still increasing. And when we look at that, there's so many factors. Distraction, motorists that are driving too fast on our roads, people that are in a rush, applications like Waze, where we've got people taking alternate routes to get from A to B that they didn't take before. Because,
this is the app on your smartphone.
Computer applications that are helping you get somewhere faster. Mm-hmm. This rush, we need to get a message across to people to not be in a rush.
Do you find distracted driving is still a big problem? People on their cell phones while driving?
Distracted driving is a huge problem. Distracted driving, arguably, is a leading cause in all of this. Distraction as well with pedestrians. We have people that are going about their day-to-day life and they are addicted to this device that they must look at. They feel they must look at it on an ongoing basis. Motorists, pedestrians, other road users, and the ultimate result is devastating.
We should, I mean, you've made a good point here, Patrick, which is that it's not just motorists who are on their smartphones when they ought not to be. Pedestrians do this when they're crossing the street too, right?
Pedestrians do have their phones, and they do have their phones when they cross the street. But you have to understand, there's a very big difference. And when people start saying, oh, pedestrians are on their phone and they're part of the problem, it really is a form of victim blaming, because when you're on your phone and you're in a car, firstly, you're distracted. It could be even seen as equivalent to being drunk. You're impaired. You hit somebody, you're going to kill them. What happens to you is very little. You get a dent on your car. You're preserved in your car. If a pedestrian, though, when we're talking about deterrence, they have self-preservation. They make a mistake, they get hurt or killed. That inherent self-preservation restricts them from doing that. But there's very little restriction on the drivers driving around with phones, and in fact, being in a position where they're going to kill somebody.
We're going to come back to more of this in a second. What would you add to the list of reasons why the numbers seem to be so much higher this year than last?
I would, to the list that's been outlined here, I think I would add that, we're working as a society to provide people with more safe choices. And, our governments are encouraging people to walk and bike and take transit. And yet the design of our streets, which I'll continue to repeat, hasn't caught up to the number of people who are out taking transit, walking, and cycling. So there's not enough clear, safe spaces for everyone to really be sharing the road. Design
meaning, I mean, again, we know, because we've had transportation experts on this program, that design is a thing. But to most people, you design a road, you put some white lines where the lanes are, you put a yellow line down the middle, and that's a design. What's more complicated than that?
I'm glad you asked that question. So, there's opportunities that when we design our roads so that there's clear, safe spaces for all modes of transportation, we reduce the opportunities for conflict. And I was looking at a staff report actually from the city of Vancouver that came out last month. And to the idea of design, it's not just about designing for moving cars. It's about designing for moving people. And when we shift away from that idea of moving as many cars as fast as possible, we're able to look at actually increasing the capacity of our roads. And the staff report was looking at how if you look at design as including cycling and walking, you can actually start to increase your per hour roadway capacity from 20,000 people an hour to 50,000 people an hour. So it's really this shift of our roadways aren't designed just to move vehicles. They should be designed to move people, because that's who's trying to get around.
Steve, it's also, I think it's also important to note two factors. One, that roadway design can increase motorist speed because of openness of roads, a wider turning radius, that sort of thing. And when we start to look at from an engineering point of view, and you look at tighter intersections and tighter turning radius, et cetera, it forces motorists to slow down, to do what it is that they're trying to do. That design will, over time, help us in making our roadways safer. I think it's also important to note the research coming out of the US as a causative factor in what is being viewed across all of the states, which is the increasing legalization that has happened over the last several years of cannabis. They believe is a leading cause as well that is leading to pedestrian death and death of vulnerable road users across the spectrum.
Now that's interesting, because let me just do a quick follow-up there, because people I have talked to say there ought to be fewer casualties and problems with pedestrians and cyclists, because if anybody's driving while toking or driving having toked, because it tends to make you drive more slowly as opposed to take more risks. And therefore, logic says there ought to be fewer problems. Not the case? Not the case.
Not the case. And unfortunately, this is something that requires a great deal more study, a great deal more research. We are, this is relatively new ground in terms of looking at the impact of that on vulnerable road users and on the entire road user population. But as you look at the indicators, and our drug recognition experts will tell you, it's clear there is obvious impairment, and it affects decision making, it affects the manner in which you operate a vehicle. And any form of impairment takes away from the driver's ability to make those good decisions and operate that vehicle safely, and to have the primary focus being the operation of that vehicle, or getting from A to B safely.
Okay, let me get some feedback from all of you on some of the changes that have taken place very recently in the province of Ontario, and I'm thinking now of the Highway Traffic Act. Your predecessor, Jamie, Eleanor McMahon, who's now a Minister of the Crown in the Kathleen Wynne Liberal government, used to have your job and had made it a mission of hers to make a couple of things. Number one, to have new categories for careless driving. So now it's not just, it's careless driving causing death, careless driving causing bodily harm now. Those are new and those are there. We are also apparently the only jurisdiction in the country right now that offers the highest penalties allowed under the Highway Traffic Act for these kinds of offenses. So clearly there's an attempt to get tougher on this kind of malfeasance. The question is, this is all about to go into effect. What are the expectations for the impact that those changes will make?
I think that the biggest impact of these increased penalties is communicating a message that our behaviors on the road have serious consequences, and it can be serious injury or death, both for people in cars and people who are out walking and cycling. And I do not think that our previous legislation accurately reflected that our decisions to drive carelessly or distracted could have those serious consequences.
But they do now?
But you know, this is a really excellent step in the right direction to communicate that, you know, jail times are increased, fines can be increased. This is something serious. But I would highlight that this is not happening in a vacuum, and it's not one size fits all that will solve this problem. It's going hand in hand with things like infrastructure investments in building safer spaces, as well as education and awareness campaigns to alert people to these new changes and let them know what their responsibilities are.
Patrick, give me your take on these changes to the Highway Traffic Act.
Steve, I know it well. I represent a coalition. It's called the Vulnerable Road User Coalition. It includes Walk Toronto, Cycle Toronto, ARC, United Seniors. The City of Toronto had a pandemic of road fatalities going on. They passed a motion unanimously asking the provincial government to bring in what was called the Vulnerable Road User Law. And it simply says that if you hit and seriously injure, kill a vulnerable road user, a pedestrian or cyclist, then outside of the regular fine or penalty that you're going to be given, you're going to be given an extra penalty. And that extra penalty is your license is going to be suspended until you take a driving course. Number two, you're going to do some community service hours in road safety. And these were a law that actually, this law exists in other states. This was put to the government in a private member's bill, Bill 158, and the government turned it down. And we tried to as well amend that present government bill in relation to careless driving to add this on. And again, that was turned down. So there's a lot of people feeling that, yes, that was a positive step by the Liberal government to bring in increased penalties in careless driving. You've got to remember, careless driving, the majority of people hit, killed by cars do not get charged. The driver does not get charged. When they do get charged, if it's careless, it gets dropped down to a lower offense. The person almost invariably walks away with a small fine. There's hundreds of examples that we've put towards the government.
But let me follow up on one angle you just brought forward there, and that is, I thought it was a feature of the changes that were brought in last December that judges are now able to take into account the vulnerability of the victim in the case of a quote-unquote accident when they are sentencing. Is that not the case?
They've always been able to do that. They've always been able to take into consideration that it was a pedestrian or cyclist that was killed and injured by a vehicle that's 2 tons. So that's always existed in the sentencing provisions for judges to consider. I think what we need to do is realize that even with changing and increasing the penalty for careless, people are still going to walk away with small fines. And until we get mandatory minimums, why is it a big ask to say, you hit somebody with your car, you've broken the law, unsafe lane change, speeding, you've killed the person. Is it too much to ask for that we're going to take your license away until you take a driving course so that you can prove that you can bring that car onto our streets safely? And that's what was being asked.
I think the fact is the provincial governments can only, they deal in offenses that are 2 years less a day, right?
The problem
And
is,
therefore, that's the case here.
what's happening is an overall trend in decriminalizing what was formerly criminal behavior. And if you look at investigations into traffic fatalities, we quite regularly find our investigators find themselves in a quagmire where they do not have evidence to proceed with a criminal charge, and trying to take the behavior and to have an appropriate penalty and deal with it in a court sufficiently that it can address the concerns of the greater road user population and the victim, et cetera. It's very, very difficult. And we're seeing that trend as well. You see administrative penalties that are being brought in with impaired driving out on the West Coast. There's a push towards that here in Ontario as well. And it's an overall decriminalization of what was formerly criminal behavior. And we do need, if we're going to continue with that, we need to ensure that there is significance and appropriateness to what the penalty would be, so that we hold people to account, we amend the behavior, and it also has a secondary impact on people so that we can set an example of how they will be held to account.
Okay, two things. Number one, we did invite, incidentally, just so people know, somebody from the Ministry of Transportation to join us here during the program. Nobody was available, so that's why they're not represented at this table. Second thing I want to raise with you, and everybody remembers this, there was this pretty controversial private member's bill put forward by a Liberal Party backbencher named Yvonne Baker from Etobicoke, when he proposed a bill that would fine people for distracted walking. So if you wanted to just cross the street with your head down in your device, you could get nailed for that. Frequent guest on the program, Martin Regcon from the Toronto Star, had this to say about that. Just as jaywalking laws are aspirational and barely enforceable, so too a ban on distracted crosswalking could be educational and rarely adversarial. The alternative is to keep playing the victim card. Cars bad, pedestrians good, your fault, not mine. Yes, drivers wield an imbalance of power and must yield the right of way. But pedestrians who walk without looking are looking for trouble, right or wrong. Okay, Patrick, your take on that.
Pedestrians, again, it gets to a deterrence, self-preservation. We learn from a very young age to look both ways, to cross the street, or else you could get hit by a car. Self-preservation, you don't need laws for that. A lot of people feel that by doing that, it's victim blaming because, firstly, shouldn't we first look at speed? The coroner's review said reduce all speeds in residential areas to 30 kilometers. All other major roads, 40 kilometers. Has that been done? It hasn't.
No, but I think what he's saying is that if you're going to walk across the road with your head down while there are cars whipping by, you get what you deserve. That's kind of what he's saying. Perhaps,
but do we need laws to legislate self-preservation? We don't. What we do need laws are for people who are in cars that are speeding, people in cars that are killing, people that are in cars are injuring, because right now they're walking away with small fines, and that's unacceptable. And so to bring that into the mix really is considered, wow, that's victim blaming. It's almost, we also saw a symposium where one of the recommendations had elderly people all dressed up in fluorescent vests. And that would be one way to prevent what's going on. And a lot of people are offended by that, especially when driver-on-driver deaths for the past number of decades has been going down. That's because the government has put a very large emphasis on the way our roads are built to protect drivers. Our government makes sure that there's collapsible steering wheels, there's airbags, there's seat belts. Everything has been conditioned to protect the driver.
Against another driver.
Against another driver, and you've seen those going down.
But not necessarily pedestrians.
Health Ontario has said, no, pedestrians and cyclists is going up.
Okay,
and
let me get to the superintendent on this. Your police service caught some flack earlier this year, I don't have to tell you. A road safety campaign targeted at pedestrians, which I'm sure you thought was common sense, but a lot of people thought, as Patrick has just suggested, it was a bit of victim blaming here. How'd that all work itself out in the wash?
I think it's really important that we maintain our position. Our position is that we want to save lives. We're committed to saving lives. We swear an oath to do so. And we have to state facts. There are people, Pat, whether you believe it or not, people walk off sidewalks and walk into oncoming cars without looking regularly. I see it. My officers see it. It's a proven fact in our investigations. People with hoodies up, earbuds in, not paying attention, walk straight off the end of a sidewalk, get run over and killed. a vulnerable road user, I agree, there is a common sense piece to this that you have to, there's self-preservation. But unfortunately, people are at times not doing that. And at the end of the day, they are vulnerable. They will die. There is potential that they get hit by a car, they're going to be seriously injured or killed. And we need to ensure that we are making our young people, our seniors particularly, seniors are overrepresented in these collisions. And there are many things we can do in terms of design, but that's not an enforcement thing. This isn't an enforcement piece. This is education, amending behavior, changing roadway design, ensuring that pedestrian crosswalks are appropriately placed, slowing motorists down, and working on distracted driving. I mean, it's a complex problem and it needs a complex solution.
Jamie, I saw you scribbling something down there. Did you want in on this as well?
Sure, I would. You know, reviewing the coroner's review of pedestrian deaths, a very small number of those deaths where the pedestrian was distracted themselves, which showed, I think the percentage was over 80%, were not distracted and were still hit and killed. So it was this idea that you know, speed, like Mr. Brown was outlining, there are other issues that are at the core. So to start by tackling pedestrian distraction did not seem like an effective or reasonable solution for the government to be taking.
Gotcha. Let's go ahead, Scott.
It is important, though, as well, to realize the number of mid-block crossings, and when our collision reconstructionists go in, and they are taking the roadway evidence, they're downloading the evidence from the vehicles, they are getting this sort of thing, and we're finding it's not speed related. Speed is not a factor in some of these collisions, and a pedestrian does not see what is happening and walks in front of a moving motor vehicle. So, I mean, we have to assist the general public in understanding the complexity of all of this. So I do see a need for lower speed limits, trying to get people to slow down, reducing distraction or anything. That driving that motor vehicle is a privilege in this province. It is something that has to be your primary and only focus when you're driving it. The same way that that pedestrian who enters in a big city, enters into a roadway, they have to make sure that the way is safe to do so. The same way that cyclists and every other vulnerable road users do.
With just a few minutes to go here, I want to see if I can get a couple of more issues on the table. I'm going to put this colloquially, but I'm sure there's a technical way of describing what I'm trying to say not very well here. Is it simply the case, Patrick, that more people are being jerks out there on the roads? People are driving less carefully, people are cycling less carefully, people are not paying attention enough when they walk, and that's contributing to all of what we're talking about today.
I don't know if I agree with all those points. I certainly think that there's been a very big increase in distracted driving. And when you increase that, meaning people using their phones and being addicted to their phones and using it, and they're happening in the cars frequently, more than 50%, then when you have that type of activity increasing, then you're seeing the fatalities, then you're seeing the injuries, because that's what's driving a 2-ton vehicle that can go at very high speeds. So I think that is, number one, a big problem. Number two, speed. Why not reduce speed? Number three, infrastructure. Come on, let's get infrastructure that allows more crosswalks, ball bouts, road diets, things that are going to slow traffic down so that people, we have over 60% of these fatality rates are in relation to seniors. They're trying to get across the street to go to a drugstore.
But let me try this. Okay, Jamie, let's go 50 feet outside this studio here. We're at Yonge and Eglinton in the middle of Midtown Toronto, biggest city in the country. There is a $6 billion LRT going in. This whole intersection has been a construction site for as far as the eye can see in every direction. The cars are backed up all over the place. There used to be 4 lanes, now there's only 2. I see it every day. People are frustrated as heck trying to get around here. Doesn't that increase? I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be gorgeous, but in the meantime, isn't that making people more selfish in the way that they drive or cycle or walk?
That's an excellent point, and certainly construction is frustrating no matter when and where it's happening, but it does need to happen. And I think you've touched on a really important point here, especially around congestion. And I think that we're seeing, especially in communities like Toronto, denser living, more and more people living in a smaller geographic area. So there's more people on our streets, and our streets are still built for 10, 20, 30 years ago worth of traffic. So there's more people out there. 100 years. Yeah. Great. Well, not great, actually. The opposite of that. You know, so yeah, it does make people frustrated and rushed, and it's this feeling of self-preservation of I need to get where I'm going at all costs. So really it's about looking at how can we increase the level of service and the continuity and clarity of our streets, because yeah, there isn't enough space for everyone.
If we, Superintendent, in our last minute here, doubled your enforcement budget for next year, would that bring the rates down significantly?
That's a really tough question. I absolutely agree that enforcement is part of this. I agree that enforcement has to be strategic. It has to be very focused on certain types of road user behaviors, and it's a very increasingly expensive resource. I think technology will provide some assistance with that in the coming years, but I think right now it is basically cops going out and doing what cops do best, and targeting very specific road user behaviors that are leading to these deaths and injuries.
I'm sure you've heard this a million times, and I'm going to say it to you for the 1,000,001st.
Yep.
If you put a cop out at Yonge and Eglinton at that intersection and just, you know, had somebody there all day long, you guys would make a fortune.
Well, it comes down to, as well, competing priorities. 911 calls, all the other major investigations that we take part in. Resources are strained in professional policing right now, and that is not going to change. So we're looking for new ways to do it, but I will say this, surety of consequence is the best way to change a behavior. And the example, all you have to do is look at downtown Toronto. Do people park illegally? They know if they leave a car parked illegally for 10 minutes, they're going to get a parking ticket. So people try to avoid doing it. The same way that we need to kind of think about our enforcement.
Gotcha. I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Patrick Brown, the lawyer at McLeish Orlando, Jamie Stuckless, Executive Director of Share the Road Cycling Coalition, and Superintendent Scott Baptist from the Toronto Police Service. Good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. Helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.